to the stage.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Well, it's good afternoon, and thank you for staying so late on day 3. You're looking well and awake, so hopefully I'll make this as entertaining as possible to keep us awake as we move through. To be honest with you, what I'm going to try and do is cover just about everything, but probably with somewhat of a medic focus as we go through here in terms of actually optimizing human performance. This is a debate which has gone on probably since the beginning of time. Have we reached the limits of human performance? But it's something that certainly within the elite athlete sphere is a really important question for a whole host of different reasons. One is about the entertainment value of world records, and with that comes a financial value to the athlete and the sport. But also it's actually about the limit of human performance when it comes to the health of athletes, and whether are we pushing the envelope of health, and so therefore are we getting closer to a deleterious impact on health as we try and push the limits of human performance. So let me just kick off with this, and I'll answer the question before we even start. It's probably the easiest thing to do. And this is work that we published some time ago. We took a look, so you may or may not remember, in the early 90s, there was a sort of foray around whether we'd reached the limits of human performance. And there were a couple of papers published by good friends of mine, Brian Whipp and Sue Ward. And what they contested was that women would run as fast as men. And sadly, they used what's called a linear regression model. I'm sure you're all familiar with linear regression. And effectively what they did is they took world record performances, they plotted a linear regression of those world record performances across time, and based upon that, they said that women would run as fast as men in the marathon by 1998. It still remains not the case. And another author at the time said that women would run as fast as men over the 100 meters by 2056. So we've still got some time to run when it comes to that. I think the interesting thing to remember, though, is that when it comes to linear regression, is it simply isn't a biologic model. And there are two things to remember about linear regression. One is that along the line, it means that at some time in the past, humans were non-ambulatory. Now, to my knowledge, I don't ever remember seeing any data that showed you that humans didn't move. And then, of course, if we take the other end of that spectrum, what a linear regression tells you is that sometime in the future, humans will be running faster than the speed of light. So I think we can just about agree that linear regression is not the model. And so what we did is we took the same data and we modeled this nonlinear model. It's an S-plot for anybody who's a geek around these type of things. But effectively what you get is you get a much better fit to the data. And what I want to show you is we did it with running and swimming. It has been done with cycling, with rowing, and with triathlon, what we call linear endurance events. The reason we picked those is because it's much easier to predict. And much of what I'm going to talk about today in terms of limits is really based around linear endurance events. But if we take a look at this, what we're talking about here is we're talking about speed. That makes a difference whether you're talking about speed or velocity or time. But the top curve, as we see it in each of these, are men, and the bottom curve are women. Anybody tell me the difference? What do we get from those graphs? Shout out, I like a bit of interaction. Women faster than men, or men faster than women? Okay, men are faster than women consistently across time, okay? Now, what's really interesting about this data, there's 3 things to take a look from this data. One is the difference between the two. And the difference between the two, irrespective of distance, and irrespective of modality, the really interesting thing about this data is that whether you're talking about running, cycling, swimming, rowing, triathlon, and whether you're talking about 50 meters in the pool versus 10-kilometer marathon swimming, or 100 meters on the track versus marathon running, is the difference between men and women holds almost constant at 11%. So there's an 11% difference in terms of speed between men and women, which holds constant and has held constant. Now, the interesting thing is if we take a look back, and the reason why there was a prediction that women would run as fast as men in the past is because if we take a look at what's called the beta value, So the acceleration of world records. So if you take a look here, for example, is a good example in the 100 meters. Really nice example, where what we see here, during the 60s, 70s, and 80s, particularly 70s and 80s with women, is we see the greatest acceleration in world record performances. Now, if you plot a linear regression model there, what you see is it comes up really quickly. Why do we think, again, let's have some interaction, why do you think women's world record performances accelerated in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s? Why would that be? Say again?
Because it became more acceptable and they were trained harder and became a profession.
That's a great answer, okay? I rarely get that answer, but that is a great answer. We're going to actually I'll come on to talk about that. So the answer there was the fact that actually it became more acceptable. And we'll definitely focus on that as we come through, because what we will see, let's take 1,500 meters for example, is that the first world record for 1,500 meters was 1972 for women, and that is because the misogynist morons who run athletics actually believed that women, if they ran beyond 800 meters in the 70s, they would irreparably damage their reproductive organs. And so therefore couldn't possibly run 1,500 meters until 1972. The 1972 Olympic Games was the first Olympic 1,500 meters. That is unbelievable, am I right? Well, let's put that into context. 1984, the first women's marathon at the Olympic Games. 1984. To put that into context even further, 2000 Olympic Games in Sydney was the first time that women were allowed to compete in pole vault. Go figure, eh? Anybody want to take a guess? The first Olympic Games when every competing nation had a female competitor. What was the first Olympic Games where every competing nation had a female competitor? Well, 2012. 2012. Okay, so and we'll come on to that point in a second about the sociological impact. Anything else? What else do you think? Why would we see this great acceleration in world record performances? Interesting one, funding. I mean, as with all these things, we look at sport through the lens of ourselves, don't we? And certainly in Britain, funding didn't come into sport until, with lottery funding in particular, until 1998. So we're a latecomer to Olympic sport funding. That's true. But certainly globally, money was well available a long time prior to that. So not necessarily the money per se, perhaps where that money was spent. Anything else? I can't believe you haven't said it. In a group of medics, you haven't said the one thing. Doping. Okay. Thank God we got there. Okay. Institutionalized, systematic doping. Okay. Without any shadow of doubt, would have played an important role. Why would there be a difference between men and women, though? Because actually, yes, there's an acceleration in men, but it's nowhere near as marked as it is in the women. Why would that be? Okay. So effectively, testosterone or male hormone-derived drug abuse. So effectively, what we tend to term as the anabolic agents. Anabolic agents have a much greater effect on bodies that don't produce it or produce it in very low levels. And so those anabolic agents, particularly in the 70s and 80s, so testosterone derivatives, have a much more profound effect on women than they do on men, number one. And obviously, when it comes to anabolic agents, that's increasing muscle mass, that's increasing strength, that's increasing power, and so therefore a resultant increase in speed. And that's why you see this absolute marked change over the shorter distances, which you don't see quite as marked over the longer distances. Anything else, do you think, during that period of time?
What about nutrition?
Okay, changes in nutrition. Change in nutrition. Interesting one, and we'll come on to that, actually. We'll come on to the role of pharma. So the change in pharma in looking after the athlete makes a big difference. And that's sort of, I would wrap that in one thing, which is what this room is full of. What improved during the 60s and 70s, do you think? Sports medicine. Okay, massive acceleration in sports medicine. Certainly when the wall came down from the Eastern Bloc, we learned a huge amount more about what we can do to the human body. Alongside that came improvements in sports science and in coaching science. That changed dramatically. What else changed? Something that makes a massive difference to performance. Any idea?
Performance gear, footwear, clothing.
Okay, equipment. So equipment changes and also facility changes. And we'll focus and take a look at some of those as we go through. But I think that the one thing I want you to take from this is that there is a difference between men and women. There is a period of maximum acceleration which is linked to factors outside of the human. And then add on top of that, the final thing to remember is if you take a look at all of these curves, what all of these curves are doing is they're starting to plateau. And as they plateau, what we are saying is, let's take this as a lovely example in the 400-meter women's. This is the last time the world record of 400 women was broken. Now, it's an interesting debate here. Kotačvalova was the record holder in that particular event, but it's taken quite some considerable period of time. Equally, if we take a look at other events, we can see that the rate of improvement in performance is decelerating. So we're breaking the world record much less often, so therefore the contention is that we are actually reaching the limits of human performance. So let's just take a look at that male versus female. We'll revisit this a little bit as we go through. There is a significant difference between men and women. Critically, that women have a lower O2 carrying capacity. Intriguingly, there is an 11% difference between men and women, irrespective of distance and modality. Concomitant with that, women have a lower hemoglobin mass equal to 10%. So there's the answer. It's because there's a difference in hemoglobin. That's what makes, no, it's not at all. But they do have a roughly 10% lower oxygen carrying capacity. They have smaller hearts and lungs, irrespective of size. So even when you scale for size, they have smaller hearts and lungs. They have a higher adiposity, and that adiposity makes a difference to power to weight ratio, amongst other things. But overall, that results in a lower aerobic power for women, even when scaled for body mass and adiposity. Add on top of that, in terms of strength, they have a lower absolute strength because they have less. So there is absolutely no difference between strength production per myofibril, but there is a much smaller muscle in women linked to the male sex hormone. So therefore, a lower absolute strength, lower power, and so therefore lower peak velocities. So there is a good physiologic reason why there is a difference between men and women when it comes to limits of human performance. Of course, we've just mentioned it in one way, but there are sociological barriers. If you think back to those graphs, what you saw from those graphs is that all of them, from world record perspective, started in the early 1900s. And that was because prior to the early 1900s, sport was professional. You could earn money from sport, and so therefore what you found from a sociological or socioeconomic perspective is that the working class could compete in sport because it actually became a way to earn money, and so therefore became their job. What happened in the Victorian era, the middle and upper classes thought it was absolutely jolly unfair that they got beaten by these working class oiks. And so what they did is that they created the amateur ethos and the amateur athletic association, the amateur swimming association. And in doing that, what they did is that they barred income from sport. Interestingly enough, that stayed in place up until the mid-1980s, where actually, effectively what it was preclusive. It made the sporting arena an exclusive club for those that could afford it. And so therefore what we see now is that world records didn't start till that time, but there was some lovely historical data which actually showed that prior to the initiation of the amateur ethos, the amateur era in the Victorian era, early 1900s, actually the working class ran an awful lot faster than world records. And there is some suggestion that Bannister's 4-minute mile was actually broken by a working class professional runner well before Bannister did it in May 1954. So it's interesting sociologically. That's from a male perspective, but we've spoken about the issue of the female perspective and effectively the barring of women from competing in sport, and therefore world records came at a later date. So there are definitely sociological barriers, which as we start to remove those sociological barriers, as we're seeing with women's sport, is we see this acceleration in world record performances as they're enabled to compete. There are psychological barriers. Who's this? And Roger did what? I've just said it, but we'll see if you were listening. 4-minute mile. Everyone knows he did the 4-minute mile, May 1954. A truly astonishing feat. What was interesting, though, for me about this, and Roger was a friend of mine, sadly passed now, but it's interesting. I've got his quote on my lab wall, and that is that at that point, the greatest runners on the planet were trying to break the 4-minute mile. But the people around, they couldn't do it. They got really, really close, but couldn't do it. And it's interesting because guys like me and you guys in the room, what we said at the time was the reason why you can't run under 4 minutes is because if you do, you will die. You'll die if you run under 4 minutes. Okay, and imagine that as an athlete. When you're running around, you're in the final straight, you've got 100 meters to go, and you might be popping under 4 minutes. You're thinking to yourself, maybe I'll ease off a bit. Because I've got to pick the kids up from school later. So, maybe I'll ease off a bit. And so it becomes a psychological barrier. Now, the interesting thing was, on this particular day, Iffley Road in Oxford, a relatively dreary day. When we talk about technology, and we'll come on to this is actually on cinder, not on what we see now as modern-day Mondo with its energy release. This is on cinder. Roger crossed the line and had broken the 4-minute record. And his quote's beautiful, which is the one I've got on my wall, and that was, he said, "I looked at the clock and realizing I had run under 4 minutes, I assumed I was dead." Absolutely brilliant. Of course he wasn't. But the interesting thing, why is it a psychological, or why do people think it's a psychological barrier, is actually that very same year, up to that point, nobody could go sub 4 minutes. And yet Roger did it in the May, and that very same year, it was broken on multiple times. His world record was broken multiple times by the same athletes with the same equipment and the same training, suggesting that there was definitely a psychological barrier to that performance. Of course, there are also significant technological barriers. I use this one because it's a lovely example of what technology has done. So anybody know is on the left? Any cycling fiends? Eddie Merckx, good call. Okay, probably. I mean, called. People loved him, so they called him the Cannibal. A truly extraordinary rider. Broke the world hour record. And when he broke the world hour record, he went just over 49 kilometers in an hour. Pretty impressive. And on the right, this is Filippo Ganna, and that was this year. And this year, Filippo Ganna set the new world record, broke the world record, and from 49 kilometers in 1972, 50 years later, there's two things you take from this picture. 50 years later, he broke the world record, and he went 56 kilometers. 56 kilometers, pretty impressive, I'm sure you'll agree. That said, 56 kilometers works out at about 0.147 kilometers an hour per year quicker. 0.1 kmh per year quicker. It's not a great improvement, is it, when you think about it? Interestingly enough, this was broken, and I don't say this about Eddie Merckx, but this was broken at a time when doping was ubiquitous in sport in general, and at this time, we can say what we like about cycling, but certainly the rigors of drug testing are much more obvious. But I think the interesting thing to take a look at here, though, when we talk about technological advances, number one is the bike. So this is a steel bike, a classic steel A-frame bike. Everybody knows what they are. You don't see them about very often now. That's because generally people don't ride them because they weigh about 2.5 tons. They're about the same weight as a Range Rover Evoque. And clearly that makes a difference. Now add on top of that, things like the tires make a big difference. The wheels, can you see these are steel spoke wheels? What Filippo Ganna's riding here, it was actually 3D printed. He's on a printed frame. So he's on a 3D printed frame. Add on top of this, he's got these carbon disc wheels, make a massive difference. He's also on what are called high pressure tubs. So there's a huge pressure going through here. So what we've done in the interim time, what's happened is, just from the technology perspective, is we've now got a bike which weighs about the 10th of the weight, It is aerodynamic. Add on top of that, we've now got aerodynamic wheels. We've got high pressure, so we reduce the rolling resistance. In general, rolling resistance adds about 5% of drag. What's interesting is actually it's this. Around about 80% of drag is offered by the body on the bike. And what we do is by changing the position into this much more aero position, we reduce drag significantly. Add on top of this, I should have shown you the video, but I did some wind tunnel testing a couple of years ago. And what we did in the wind tunnel is we changed socks. And what we showed is we could reduce drag by 1% just by wearing the right sock. So all those things make a huge amount of difference. Add on top of that, the velodrome, where we operate, has changed significantly, rolling resistance much lower. Add on top of that, air pressure is very closely monitored, as is the air conditioning of the room. One of the key problems to breaking this particular world record is actually heat generation. You become incredibly hypothermic rapidly. One thing we should always remember is, I've listened to an awful lot of heat over the last 3 days, is that the human is incredibly inefficient. We've got about the same efficiency as an internal combustion engine. That is that 3/4 of the energy that we produce is dissipated as heat. 3/4 of it. And that's why when we exercise, we heat up incredibly quickly. And it's why heat, it really is the nemesis when it comes to endurance performance and in terms of these reaching the limits of human performance. But what this tells us is that technology plays a key role when it comes to that. Now, this is fairly obvious, making small margins. This sort of thing makes an absolutely massive difference to performance. Anybody know who this is? Anybody know who this is? Yeah, Pistorius. Okay, we don't like to say his name much anymore, do we? But interesting this, because he became the first Paralympic athlete to compete at the Olympic Games. But that was enabled simply through the prostheses that he uses, which took an individual who was unable to run and can now run. Massive differences in terms of world record performances based upon technology and the improvement in technology. So, and let's take a look at the physiologic limits. And these are perhaps some of the really interesting areas of physiologic limits. Everybody knows who this is? So this is Mo, yeah. And what we're talking about here, let's talk about maximum aerobic capacity, VO2 max. Well, VO2 max is Q max, so cardiac output max, which is stroke volume max times heart rate max. So it's governed by stroke volume and heart rate. Times by AVO2 difference, arterial venous oxygen difference, which is governed by oxygen carrying capacity in the blood. Which is governed in part by the lung, which then is governed by hemoglobin and then myoglobin in the muscle. And then the uptake of that myoglobin with mitochondrial size and density, oxidative enzyme activity as it comes through, and a whole host of other factors. So there's a whole chain of events that can change VO2 max. Why do we care about this? Well, when it comes to linear endurance, VO2 max is of critical importance when it comes to endurance performance. So let's take a look and sort of dissect that down and see where the limits lie, if limits do lie. And let's take a look at this. Limits of the lung. It's an interesting one. And to some extent, this is where a big debate sits around the limits of the lung. But let's take a look at things like, importantly, pre-training versus post-training. And I think one of the issues around limits of human performance is, can we train? Is it trainable? And if it's trainable, what that then suggests that if we can train it, we can improve it. And so therefore, are we limited in that improvement, or can we improve it a little bit more? But are there areas that we can't train? And the lung is a really interesting area, because what we see really, in terms of conductance, what we see is that within the heart, increased conductance, in the circulation increased, and in the muscle increased. And yet with training, no change in the lung. So the lung appears relatively untrainable, which is really interesting. Now, there is definitely debate around the issue of the respiratory musculature. Remember, it's an active process of breathing, requiring a change in intrathoracic pressure, which is created by contracting muscle. So it's, most importantly, is the diaphragm, and then of course the intercostal muscles, but then subsidiary muscles like the sternocleidomastoids, which can enhance it as well. What we do know during exercise is that there is what we call the respiratory steal. So just the work of breathing consumes oxygen. The more oxygen you consume for breathing, the less oxygen you can deliver to the working musculature, and so therefore you limit performance. So if there is some way that we can reduce the respiratory steal, the oxygen consumption of the respiratory system, what we can do is we can increase the availability. Some lovely studies which used ventilators and then measured blood flow to the leg and oxygen delivery to the leg. And what that showed really nicely is during cycling exercise, if you ventilate, I mean, these are pretty sad experiments, aren't they? I'm not sure I'd really want to be a participant in them, but if you ventilate the cyclist, what that does is it offloads the respiratory muscles and actually increases the oxygen delivery to the legs and therefore enhances performance. So are the respiratory muscles trainable is a debate that ensues, and there's a lot of work that's gone on at various places, Birmingham into Brunel in London and out in the US, which would suggest that inspiratory and expiratory muscle training can enhance performance. In essence, it's really equivocal whether that occurs or not. So to some extent, it would suggest that the lung is limited. Now let's hop across species. I put this picture up because I love horses. It's got nothing to do with the talk, but I just thought we'd take a look at a horse and it would brighten the day. Now, the important thing about this is, what's interesting when you look at other species, so if we look at the elite horse, what we do know is that the lung is fundamentally the limiter to equine performance. And what happens, a couple of things to notice here. Firstly is the spatter that you see over the jockey. Often that spatter we can mistake as mud. Actually, often it is blood. It's effusate from the lung. The way in which the horse ventilates is actually by movement of the abdominal cavity into the lungs themselves. So it's like a piston action as it comes forward. And because it's so mechanical, what it can do at very high gallop rates is can actually cause damage to the lung endothelium and can cause leakage, and so therefore blood effusate into which you often see coming out of horses. The other thing to remember here, which is interesting, is they've got massive nostrils. They've got massive nostrils, and the other thing is, this is at peak gallop, the mouth is closed. And that is because the horse 100% nasal ventilates during exercise. So it's really important. Now, the reason I tell you that is just because it is incredibly different from humans. I listened to a talk earlier that sort of mentioned this. In humans, around about 50% so above moderate intensity physical activity, the human 100% mouth breathes. Now that has an important implication in terms of the upper respiratory tract and upper respiratory drying, airway drying, which we'll take a brief look at when it comes to things like exercise-induced asthma and the implications of that as we go forward, particularly in environmental extremes like very arid and cold environments. But humans 100% mouth breathe. Note to self, nasal strips, absolute nonsense when it comes to human performance. It might help with snoring, but it's not going to help on the final straight of 1,500 meters at the Olympic Games. But is the lung trainable?
Is a superhuman.
You have to see it to believe it.
Oh! Freediving is all about what you can do on a single breath of air.
How can one individual push themselves so far beyond what a normal individual can do?
I can do it, you can do it, no one can do it, he can do it.
You cannot run and you cannot hide. You're just caught inside your body.
Freediving is incredibly dangerous.
We have to be prepared for the worst.
We don't know which stage he's going to be in.
Yeah, I'm starting to cramp up.
He is in the death zone.
These temperatures are so low that some people might have cardiac arrest.
The cold is a life-threatening danger.
You can easily black out because you have used up all your oxygen reserves.
You become unconscious. Unconscious underwater means death.
Of course, he makes it look so easy, but it's so cold.
So this is the dangerous moment. Hopefully I've timed my dive and my training so that the hole is there.
So there's always a great question of whether we can train it or not. Anybody know what the average human breath hold is? We could try it, but I don't want anybody to collapse. It's about 30 seconds. 30 seconds is what we hold our breath for. That's at rest. That was 2 minutes 11 exercising in water that was, because it's brackish, we actually filmed this in northern Scandinavia, -1 degree centigrade. Now we'll talk about the cold shock response and hyperventilation, but for 2 minutes 11. Now I don't know if you saw halfway through that when he was in the pool with his head in the water. So we filmed this for Discovery a few years ago. And he holds the world record for what's called pre-oxygenated static apnea. So what he does is he hyperventilates at the surface. He goes down to depth, breathes in 100% O2 for around about 5 minutes. So effectively what he does is he offloads all carbon dioxide. Incredibly dangerous to do, because that's the driver for respiration, as we well know. And then when he comes up to the surface, he takes a final breath, and then holds his breath in water. Any idea how long that would be? Average is 30 seconds. Anybody want to take a guess? 7, 8 minutes, 20 minutes, 22.5 minutes. He holds his breath for. And it's amazing to watch it. You should watch it's not a spectator event, to be fair. But nonetheless, it is intriguing to watch the convulsions as the brain as CO2 starts to rise and the respiratory centers are driving to breathe. What he's doing is consciously closing the glottis over the trachea, and the convulsions that you see while he's attempting to do that, absolutely astronomical. So to some extent, there is a trainability to the lung. How about the blood? Are there limits in the blood? Well, yes, there are limits in the blood, and I think many of you guys will spend an awful lot of time looking around this, particularly when you go up to altitude, associated with this oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. It matters. The higher we go up in altitude, the lower it comes down. But fundamentally, are we limited? Well, what we know is it's trainable without any shadow of doubt. And so talking about altitude, often what we do is we take athletes to altitude training camps to try and induce erythropoiesis, the EPO, so that we get an increased red cell count. That increased red cell count leads to increased hemoglobin. It also it leads to increased plasma volume. We'll come back onto that, which leads to an increased stroke volume and cardiac output max, and so therefore an increased VO2 max by delimiting, to some extent, the blood. Now, we do that naturally by going up to altitude or using normobaric hypoxic chambers. What we could do is we could just inject it. And EPO, as we well know, a very, very good drug if you want to improve endurance performance, unequivocally improves endurance performance, and is probably the drug of choice when it comes to elite endurance and ultra-endurance activity. Of course, it is illegal. So there are limits to blood. The question is, are there cardiac limits? And we've published a huge amount on this. And I think the issue is that there's no doubt about it that it is trainable. So what we see is when we compare athletes to non-athletes, what we see is that we see an increase let's talk about the left ventricle in essence, but LVIDD, so internal diameter is increased. We see an increase in wall thickness, both septal and posterior wall. We see an increase in left ventricular mass. We see an increase in left ventricular end diastolic volume. And all of that leads to an improvement in stroke volume and cardiac output. But there is a limit. And certainly when we've measured tens of thousands of athletes, elite athletes across the globe, and what we know is that there is an upper limit of those cardiac dimensions, which means that there is a limit to how high or how trainable that is. So clearly there are cardiac limits within it. Are there limits within muscle? And are they trainable? Now, there's an awful lot of genetic predisposition here, and we'll talk about that very briefly. But this is just stained samples, if you guys have seen these before. This is fast twitch fibers. The fast twitch fibers are stained white, so they're nice and bright in a sprint athlete. And on the right-hand side, this is an endurance athlete, and the slow twitch fibers are stained dark. So you can see the dramatic difference between sprint and endurance athletes. Is that trainable? Well, fundamentally, what's much more difficult to do, we can't change slow twitch fibers to any great extent into fast twitch. Interesting enough, we can make fast twitch fibers more oxidative. So we can take sprinters and train them into endurance. But fundamentally, if you're already here, there's not a huge amount of improvement to be made. Now, of course, there are potentially ways around that. Can we increase strength? Well, there are ways of increasing strength. This is my wife in the middle. No, it's not. I'm joking. It's not. What's it on the left? What's interesting here is that what we've done is that there is a natural increase. What do you think maybe, let's postulate here. What do you think may be going on here? Okay, so certainly performance enhancing in some way, nutritionally, pharmacologically, to reach this, to what effectively what is to go beyond the limit, this plateau in muscle mass. And that muscle mass is regulated. Anybody know what it's regulated by? It's like a teaching class, isn't it? Sorry about this. I just enjoy a bit of interaction. Okay, it's regulated by myostatin. And myostatin is really important. What we can do, potentially, is switch off myostatin. And if we switch off myostatin, what you get to is this. It's the Belgian blue. Why would you want to switch off myostatin in a cow, in what was a bull in this particular instance, but in livestock? Any particular reason why you do that? Yeah, there's a lot of money to be made from it. The big problem that you get, which is not too dissimilar to the problem that you get here, is that actually they get to a point with myostatin switched off where they're too heavy to stand. And so therefore they die. So there are ramifications of those type of things. And we'll talk sort of briefly about genetics, whether we can switch on or switch off. Often the problem is not switching on or off, it's actually regulating it once we have done that. Of course, sometimes what we think is that this is what we're trying to get to. And I think what we always have to remember is that, are we limited? Of course we're limited. Evolution tells us that to some extent. But there are obviously animal species that we are trying to emulate. Everyone knows there's the cheetah. Top running speed, 66 miles an hour, measured by a good friend of mine in the 1960s, Craig Sharp, if you know him. Astounding animal when it comes to speed. But clearly, are we limited? Are humans limited in terms of maximum speed? In other words, will there be some point in the future where we can run as fast as cheetahs? Anybody think we will? Will cheetahs always be quicker than us? Let me just show you this because it might change your mind. Obviously not true, but thank you. Very unlikely. So therefore, to some extent, if we don't believe that is the case, then we must be limited. We must be limited at some point. The question is, are we currently at the limits of human performance? Lots of people talk about genetics. I'm not going to go on about this in any great depth, but I think there are a host of critical problems when it comes to this idea that genetics is what matters, and what we can do is now gene dope. So if we can identify the performance gene, what we can do is we can therefore we can splice it, we can put in a better performing gene, and so therefore we can delimit performance. Well, number one, this is some of the work back from the early 2000s and increased since then. But if you take a look at it, in terms of fitness and performance, around 214 autosomal gene traits, 7 chromosome, 18 mitochondria, about 250 different areas on the gene that are going to impact on performance. Well, you can't change all of them. And the question is, which one do you change to bring about performance enhancement? Well, remember that it is a complex interaction. That it's not just about heart size, because there's no point pumping more blood around if you can't carry more oxygen. There's no point having more oxygen if you can't consume that oxygen at the muscle. So you have to then, by affecting one, you've got to affect them all. And the question is, can you gene dope all of these areas? Interesting enough, there was some work where they actually did gene dope EPO, the EPO gene, and one of the biggest problems they got in the rat model is that effectively hemoglobin rose so rapidly they had coagulation problems and sudden death. Because again, it's not about switching it on, it's about regulating it, which is the critical thing. So to some extent, we are limited by genetics in that we can't change it. What about environmental limits? Without any shadow of doubt, there are environmental limits, and much of what we've spoken about over the past few days have been based around this. So I've just put up here some of the races that I've done. So this was one we did in 2020 where we broke the world record for 7 marathons on 7 continents. And we completed 7 marathons on 7 continents, including the running, in 81 and a half hours. But the interesting thing about that particular challenge was we started in Wolfsfang in Antarctica, minus 20 relative humidity, and with wind chill minus 30. That worries us because the potential for endothelial lung damage, remember through his high ventilatory rates, 200 litres a minute, on very arid, cold air can cause all sorts of problems in the lung. But within 24 hours, we're running the 3rd marathon within 24 hours in Panama, and it was 40 degrees centigrade and 90% humidity. So from a challenge perspective, from an environmental challenge perspective, it really is, it's the rate of change of environment on a challenge like this that makes a difference. Add on top of that, we just listened to it, and it's great because it is the mantra, not just the jungle, but this was the Marathon des Sables. Heat and feet is a critical issue. And heat is an issue, but it's actually dehydration which is the critical factor, because remember, it's evaporative sweat loss, which is absolutely fundamental to thermoregulation in humans. Is what makes us the dominant species on the planet, but actually we do require fluid intake in order to maintain that across time. Then we come into areas like cold water immersion. Cold water is 25 times more conductive than air. It strips heat very, very rapidly, incredibly dangerous. But equally on land can be problematic. When you take a look at something like this, the race across America, you've got all of these factors combined. So actually, you start off across the Mojave Desert, 40 degrees centigrade. You then climb up into altitude, and that brings altitude into play. This is actually on Kilimanjaro, where I was racing. At 3,500 meters, just within 24 hours coming from sea level. You've then got heat coming across, you've then got cold, obviously with altitude as you move across. So it combines all these things. So there are lots of factors that will limit performance, where we are now starting to squeeze that out as far as humans can go. And let's just take a quick look at what heat can do. Remember, I spoke at the beginning, it's not just about performance, it's also about athlete health. This is what happens in terms of environment when it goes wrong.
Just yards behind, her stalker appears. It's Wendy Ingram.
It's a hell of a technique, this. So to put it in perspective, they've already swum 3.8 kilometers, they've cycled 180 kilometers, and this is at the end of a 42-kilometer marathon run. And they've got about 50 meters to go. If you check out some of the other athletes that are actually running past, they're male athletes, that's not because they're male, they're in a different race. These guys are 3rd and 4th place in the world. And 3rd place at the World Ironman Championships is governed by crawling across the line. And we spoke about it briefly right at the end of the last presentation about the cascade of heat problems, ranging from heat stress, they're definitely in heat stress, through to heat injury. Well, they're definitely in heat injury. And the downstream cascade, if they don't get the right input, they will become hypothermic very rapidly, move into heat stroke and potentially die. So medical support at this point is absolutely fundamental. Sadly, for some of these athletes, they never return to international competition. So bad is the heat injury that they receive. To some extent, all of these, and you're probably looking at this thinking, well, this is elite athlete. I think what's interesting, I'll just finish off with this, is I've been lucky enough, I look after all the sport relief, comic relief, and children in need charity events, the big challenges. I've looked after 38 of them now. And what we've seen in recent times is this exponential rise in the general populace whether they're celebrities or just general population, are now taking on some of these incredibly difficult challenges, incredibly arduous in very, very difficult environments. And so we look at the rise of ultra-endurance events in some of the toughest environments on the planet, and we're starting to see a much bigger increase in that. And so to some extent, those limits that we talk about, limited in terms of limits of absolute limit, versus the limits of individuals. And I think as we move down that cascade, and what's really important for you guys working in extreme medicine, is it's actually the danger really is in this group below. These guys who are less conditioned, less experienced, taking on some of these really big challenges in some of these really difficult environments. And there are a host of factors that you do have to take account of. And making sure that you are prepared to intervene at the right time, whatever that is, because it ranges. It can be just blisters on the feet. Equally, it could be life-threatening high-altitude cerebral edema or hyperpyrexia that needs instant and very aggressive and very rapid intervention. Understanding the breadth of those issues is absolutely crucial to the limits of human health in these environments. I'll just finish off. I said we try and make it a bit entertaining, but just to say that this next thing we're going to take a look at is cold shock response. Cold open water swimming is now the fastest growing sport in the UK. And what that means is attracting people who have absolutely no experience into it at all. And one of the things that we always worry about is what we call the cold shock response. Around 80% of open water drownings occur because of the cold shock response. And people often say to me, what does the cold shock response look like? Well, this is what it looks like. Oh, have we got sound on this? No sound. It's nowhere near as funny without sound. That's a shame, because this was the entertaining piece. Anyway, cold shock response. I think what we have to be careful of is making sure that we are looking after athletes, not just elite athletes, but athletes across its broadest spectrum as we go through. And so because of that, what we effectively now have, because it's performance is an incredibly complex socioeconomic interaction, which now requires this whole massive team that sits around them to enhance that performance. In elite athletes, we see it. And in elite athletes, generally, they are surrounded now by these huge teams who are not only looking after their performance, but looking after their health. This role is absolutely critically important in that health piece, without any shadow of a doubt. Sadly, for many people that you come into contact with, they don't sit in this realm. They haven't got the support staff and the team around them to make sure that they stay in that realm. So to some extent, you become the only person in this entire cascade, which makes your job even more important to ensure that you keep these people safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. We have time for one quick question from online and one from the audience. There's one that came in from online about nutrition, talking about the limits of substrate absorption and digestion and how that affects performance. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, 100% on that. I think interesting, we didn't sort of speak about it too much in there, but nutrition does play a key role, whether it's hydration or whether it's substrate availability. Let's take carbohydrates, for example. Well, there is a maximum uptake of carbohydrate in the gut, around about 60 grams an hour of carbohydrates. Now, the interesting thing is that the receptors for that, for glucose and fructose, are slightly different. And so what we've seen now in recent times is an evolution of sports drinks, which include both glucose and fructose to try and elevate that 60 grams an hour slightly. I think that the critical thing around that, interestingly enough, again, is it a limit? The question back from that is it trainable? And certainly what we do know is the gut is trainable. And so what I would say as a piece of advice, if you are going to use products, nutritional products to enhance performance, you should absolutely use them in training, not just in competition.
And to your point, the BBC once had this really fun but informative article on the diet of Michael Phelps when he was at his peak. And just Google it, because that man eats in one sitting what most of us eat in a week. So. Before we close it off, any questions from the floor? One right out here up front.
It's about nasal breathing during training versus mouth breathing.
Yeah.
Does it have any positive impact on oxygen carrying capacity or VO2 max?
It's a great question. It's actually using nasal breathing in training and whether that improves the trainability, so the adaptive response. I'll tell you where I first saw it was in South Africa back in the 80s. And I watched some elite Ethiopian runners doing a track session with a dummy in their mouth, with a pacifier if you're American, but with a dummy in their mouth. And I was just blown away. I thought, what on earth are they doing? Chatting with the coach, the reason they were carrying a dummy was to reduce ventilation through the mouth. So actually, effectively what it did is it made the work of breathing much harder. They had to breathe, that respiratory steel was much greater. So rather than it being sort of around about 10 to 15% is taken by the respiratory musculature at high intensity exercise, that would be moving much higher than that. And the essence of that was an interesting one. Is there a physiologic benefit? And so we've taken a look at hypoxic environments in general, but hypoxic by reducing breathing. So swimming is a classic example where we use it a lot, where you reduce the number of breaths per stroke. And that hypoxic inducement doesn't appear to have a great deal of impact on physiology, but what it does do is it has a significant impact on psychology, and that then changes mechanics and economy. And so effectively, what the athlete appears to get is a much better ability to cope with the misery, much better. And so what they do is they actually maintain economy much better over time. But I've never seen any work on it, is the answer to that. It may be possible, is the answer to that. But then I think what you have to, I think teasing it out would be quite difficult, because I think what happens is that as you get used to it, you become effectively more relaxed, and so therefore you'll have a higher vagal tone and certainly a lower sympathetic tone. And so it's teasing out whether there's a physiologic change or whether it's actually a psychologically driven change that changes physiology. But yeah, I mean, interesting.
Thank you so much. Will you be around during the break to answer
more
questions?
Yep,
Perfect. Okay, so that brings us to break time. We will see you back here at 1700, 5 p.m. for the last session of WEM 2022. Enjoy coffee, enjoy conversation. See you back here in 30.